Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Pallay, and thanks for being with us. So before we get started with today's show, just a quick special request for our listeners as we end the year and start thinking about 2025, what we're thankful for, and what we want to do with the show. We want to hear from you. Tell us what you like about the show. Tell us what you don't like. Tell us what you'd like to see. Of course, how are you going to tell us? We're not a call-in radio show. You've got to email us. You've got to tweet at us. You got to send us a message somewhere that gets to Frank, our podcast producer, so he can hear it and digest it and figure out what we can do with that information. We really want to hear from you, so you can email us at ontheballot@ballotpedia.org or on X at Ballotpedia or in the comment box or whatever is easiest for you. I promise it'll find its way to our team. Thanks for your help. Let's get to the episode now. It's been almost a month since Election Day, and now that the dust is starting to settle, analysts and outlets are happily poring over the data to make sense of how things played out. One of the interesting bits of analysis we like to look into is around ticket splitting. So we're going to take an early look at that and how voters cast their ballots with two guests on today's show. First, I'm joined by Kondik, the managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball at the University of Virginia Center for Politics. Kyle, good morning, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so let's back up for a second because, we who work in this space can sometimes forget that these certain terms are very obvious to us. But tell our listeners, what do we mean by split ticket voting?
I think classically what that means is that a voter chooses different parties in different races. And so, you could have maybe a Trump voter who votes for a Democratic Senate candidate down the ballot. I would also consider someone who votes for a major party candidate for president and then maybe a non-major party candidate for Senate. I would also consider that person to be a ticket splitter. And I think that the general dynamic in, down ballot races is that there's been less ticket splitting over time. There are, generally speaking, have been fewer House districts, for instance, that vote for one party for president and the other party for Senate. In both 2016 and 2020, there was only a single Senate race. Maine in 2020, where one party won for president, and the other party won for Senate. Susan Collins, Republican, winning re-election. In this election, we had four states, have a different outcome for Senate and for president, which was higher than what we'd seen certainly in 2016 and 2020.
Yeah, you're kind of getting right into it. That we saw a little bit of a return to that. It seemed like this cycle. And just sort of remind our listeners also, one of the reasons why people say split ticket voting is because there are some states that actually allow for what's called straight ticket voting, where you can just click one button and go straight ticket all the way up and down the ballot. This year, we did sort of return to a little bit more split ticket voting, which is what you're kind of alluding to earlier. So put that in perspective a little bit. Let's just sort of play out in a specific example. What did that actually look like in some states?
Well, the ones that we were really looking at right before the election, I mean, it was sort of the five presidential battleground states that both sides were competing for that also had Senate races. Democrats were defending those Senate seats in those states, Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Trump ended up winning all five of those states for president, and some of them, particularly Arizona, weren't even that close. Trump won Arizona by 5.5 points. Democrats did hold for those five Senate races, with Pennsylvania being the only exception. And Arizona is probably the best example where there very likely were voters who actually did split their tickets in terms of voting for Donald Trump for president, but Democrat Ruben Gallego for Senate. If you compare the actual results there, Gallego won the Senate race by about 2.5 points over Kari Lake, the former gubernatorial nominee. Donald Trump, as I mentioned, won by 5.5 points. So in terms of vote share, Ruben Gallego got a 3.5 points higher share of the vote than Kamala Harris did, and Kari Lake ran about 4.5 points behind Donald Trump's share of the vote. In the other states, it was a little bit more mixed. In Nevada, for instance, Jackie Rosen only got 0.4 of a point more than Kamala Harris did. But Sam Brown, the Republican Senate candidate, ran 4.5 points behind Trump. So this is where Arizona, again, I think is the best example of actual ticket splitting. In some of these other states, I think it was more like the Democrats maybe ran only very slightly ahead of Kamala Harris, but the Republican Senate candidate couldn't consolidate all the Trump vote. Maybe some people skipped the Senate race. Maybe some people voted their party for Senate.
What are you seeing, if there's been any reporting around exit polls or commentary around what were some of the issues that seem to stand out for the ticket splitters? Did anybody do any data into that and find out, were there any key topics that mattered most at that sort of like grouping of voters?
Where I feel like I've seen that most is in Arizona, again, just because the difference between the Senate and the presidential race was so stark in that state. I think Ruben Gallego ended up being sort of a better messenger on immigration, which is, was an important issue in this election, but particularly in that state. I think it's pretty likely that Gallego held up much better with Latino men in that state. Gallego did specific kinds of events and whatnot to sort of cultivate that group. Maybe being, more trusted on immigration was maybe part of what happened with Gallego. I think Gallego, who also was sort of known as being kind of a more progressive slash left-wing member of the House, he kinda tried to move to the middle a little bit more, and I think was certainly more successful at that than Kamala Harris was in general in, obviously, Arizona, but also across the country. It's hard to know how much it mattered in terms of the election itself, but, Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin was another one who, Democrat who won by a little less than a point, while Donald Trump won the state by a little less than a point himself. Baldwin was endorsed by the Farm Bureau in Wisconsin, generally kind of more of a conservative leaning group. And maybe that contributed a little bit to her ability to, again, just do a little bit better than Harris did in the state. One other
And you
one other
mentioned,
interesting
yeah, go ahead.
dynamic I just want to make sure I mentioned was that in this sort of, mix of the voting patterns, in almost all of the key Senate races, the sort of other vote, voters who've actually voted in the contest and voted for a candidate who was not a major party candidate, or in the case of Nevada, you could actually vote for none of the above. And that
Yeah.
is also why the sort of other vote in Nevada was higher than in some of these other races. 6% of all the votes cast for Senate were cast for somebody other than a major party candidate. But the other vote in the Senate races was almost always larger than the other vote for president. It may be that particularly for maybe lower information voters, they have a sense of who the presidential candidates are, but maybe they don't in the Senate race. And so maybe they vote for the Libertarian for some reason, or they vote for the Green Party candidate for some reason. Maybe it's just a higher incidence of protest voting. Maybe Democrats voting for the Green Party candidate because of the Gaza issue or some other complaint about the Democrats. Republicans voting for the Libertarian because they, maybe were turned off to the Republican Senate candidate because of attack ads or something like that. But it was sort of an interesting dynamic that the other vote was generally higher in these Senate races than they were in their corresponding presidential races in those states.
Yeah, this is something that we dig into, as I'm sure every election analyst does every cycle, is looking at the races where a third party candidate got more votes than the margin between the top two finishers. And you mentioned ballot exhaustion a little earlier, and just to sort of play out a really simplistic scenario, this, let's say 100 people vote for a presidential election, and only 90 of those 100 vote in the Senate race. We would say 10 exhausted. What did you see when you were looking at these key races? Was there much ballot exhaustion? Were there some races in particular that experienced more ballot exhaustion than usual?
Almost always there's going to be fewer votes cast for in a Senate race, for instance, than the corresponding presidential.
Yep.
Historically speaking, I went back to 2000, so I looked at the last 7 presidential election cycles with Senate races, and I expressed it in terms of percentage of votes cast on average in the Senate race compared to the presidential. In
Yep.
2024, in the Senate races, it was 98%. So, to use your example, you'd have 100 votes for president, then you'd have 98 votes for Senate.
Yep.
And in the competitive races, the ones that we rated as something other than safe, it was actually about 99%. So there was a little bit less of a drop off. And the actual rate of, Senate votes cast as a percentage of presidential votes cast at 98%, that's actually higher than most of the years we looked at. Only 2020 was higher. So I was kind of wondering, and there was some discussion about this before the election that, oh, there's going to be a bunch of Trump only voters who show up, and that'll hurt Republicans in Senate races. And it is again true that to the extent that there were split outcomes, it was Democrats winning in states that Trump won for president, but it wasn't because necessarily there was a large number of Trump only voters. I mean, we don't exactly know how many Trump only voters there were, but the total number of votes cast for Senate was generally pretty comparable to that in the presidential race. There wasn't some sort of abnormal number in this election.
Yeah. So to your point, to really lay it out for listeners, there were quite a number of Trump and then, push a button for a non-Republican in the Senate as opposed to Trump and skip that one, which
That
is very.
that seemed to be more of a problem than it was just Trump-only voters. It was probably Trump voters who did not then vote Republican in the Senate race. Maybe they actually voted for the Democrat. Arizona's probably the best example where that happened. Also, like Montana and Ohio, where, you had Democrats who lost, but who did a lot better than Harris did in those states. John Tester in Montana and Sherrod Brown in Ohio. Those are also states where there's a more compelling argument that there were like a legitimate, a fair number of actual ticket splitters.
Mm.
Wisconsin, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania, I mean, Bob Casey lost, and that was one of the, exceptions in which Casey actually got a slightly smaller share of the vote than Kamala Harris did. Now, Dave McCormick ran further behind Trump, but it was still enough for him to actually win. And, there was a Green Party candidate. There were also a couple of conservative third-party candidates. I think it was a Libertarian and a Constitution Party candidate. The Libertarian and Constitution Party candidate in Pennsylvania got about a point and a half worth of support. That you would assume disproportionately hurt McCormick. But there was a Green Party candidate who got a percentage point worth of the vote. You'd assume that disproportionately hurt Casey. In Wisconsin, for instance, the two third-party candidates were both definitely right-leaning candidates, or was probably interpreted that way, and that was probably helpful to Tammy Baldwin, although she still got a slightly higher actual share of the vote than Kamala Harris did. Again, that's a key difference with her and Casey. And, Baldwin won narrowly, Casey lost narrowly.
Always very interesting to deep dive through the numbers and the data after the election. That's what we like to do. So what do you think are the trends come to mind for you? Obviously, it's very early looking ahead to 26 and 28, but what are just some kind of early indications you're thinking about as you're now looking through the 24 data to predict, how you might see things playing out in the next 2 and 4 years?
Look, I mean, we are going into a, midterm with a Republican in the White House. Presumably, typically when you see party changes, and particularly in the House, they come in the midterm year, not in the presidential year. The last time the House flipped control in a presidential year was 1952. More recently, you saw the House flip in 22. You saw it flip in 18. You saw it flip in 2010. You saw it flip in 2006. You saw it flip in 1994. And those were all instances of the party that didn't hold the White House winning House. The House, as we're talking now, is not 100% determined, but based on the current leads, it looks like 220 to 215 for the Republicans. So super narrow majority. So, you'd think that the Democrats would have a decent shot to win the House back. The Senate, the Republicans, they did leave some races on the table. I think they can look at it and say, hey, they should have been able to win more races than they actually did, but they got to 53 seats, and that's a good sized majority. When you look at the races coming up in 2026, the most competitive ones, Democrats defending Michigan and Georgia, Republicans defending North Carolina and Maine, maybe some other races come on the board. But as you just look at it right now, you don't really look at the 2026 Senate races and think, oh, well, the Democrats have a great shot to win the majority back. They really don't. Unless it's some sort of like mega wave and they compete, for a special election in Florida or a special election in Ohio or something like that. So, it's kind of reminiscent of 2018, where, the Democrats looked like they had a decent shot in the House in that midterm, but not necessarily the Senate. And that would be, I'd say, sort of the early best guess for this midterm. But, a lot of it will just be determined by how unpopular or popular is Donald Trump as president, and how effectively can Democrats sort of make the case in a midterm environment. You expect them to probably have something of a, maybe a motivation or a turnout advantage, but just based on history. But none of this stuff is written in stone.
Kyle, thanks so much for your time for coming on the show today.
Yeah, no problem.
Stay tuned. We'll be right back with Ballotpedia editor Cory Eucalittlo for more on this year's election and split ticket voting. And Kyle, I'm sure we'll have you again in 2025. Have a great season.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Hannah Nelson, External Relations Manager at Ballotpedia. This week marks Giving Tuesday, a global celebration of generosity. Here at Ballotpedia, we're proud to spotlight our Fellows Program, an initiative that provides students from across the country with meaningful volunteer opportunities. Through this program, students develop research and writing skills while gaining a deeper understanding of political engagement. Since 2020, our Ballotpedia Fellows have researched nearly 26,000 candidates, playing an essential role in providing voters with the reliable, nonpartisan information they need to make informed decisions at the polls. To continue this important work, we need your support. Please consider making a donation by visiting donate.ballotpedia.org/GivingTuesday2024. Together, we can nurture the next generation of nonpartisan information providers and ensure that voters have access to the facts they can rely on.
We're back. Now, let's dig a little more into split ticket voting and the comparisons between presidential election results and other statewide races. So, with more on that, we're going to bring on Ballotpedia Managing Editor Cory Eucalittlo. So, Cory, welcome back. Good to see you as always.
Yep. Thanks, Jeff.
So, we were talking earlier about split ticket voting, and I want to talk about a kind of unique angle that we look specifically at, which is not just who won the state. For instance, we talked a lot about Arizona earlier in this episode. Trump won the state in the presidential election. Guy won it for the Democrats in the Senate. But let's talk a little bit specifically about overperformance and underperformance. So, when we compare the candidates to all statewide races, so this is not just split ticket voting, how did those results turn out?
Yeah, so there were 61 elections this year for governor, attorney general, secretary of state, and U.S. Senate. And then obviously all 50 states in the presidential election. What we can look at is how did Trump and Harris do compared to those other statewide candidates, regardless of who won or not. So at the top level, Trump received more votes than 40 other statewide candidates and fewer votes than 21. Harris, on the other hand, received more votes than 36 Democratic candidates and fewer than 25. So actually not a really big split there. But when you get into the Senate, you can see Trump overperforming quite a few Republican Senate candidates. He received more votes than 25 Republican Senate candidates and fewer than 8. Harris, on the other hand, received more votes than 18 Democratic candidates, but fewer than 15. So you can see how the results of the presidential election might have come out of that or been related to that. And of course, there are governors, attorney generals, and secretaries.
I'll just jump in real quick. One of the things that Kyle and I were talking about earlier in the episode was, this tells us about what kind of voter was showing up to the booth. Were they pull the lever, push the button for Trump and the Republicans down the ballot? Were they pushing for Harris and Democrats down the ballot? Or was there a bit of a mixture, right, where someone said, okay, I'm voting for Donald Trump, but I'm voting for the Democratic Senate candidate or the down ballot candidate. So these numbers are letting us really dig a little deeper into that. So, all right, so with that Senate, what else from the other statewide races? Now I'm done jumping in.
Yeah. Governors was a pretty even split for Trump. He got more votes than 5 Republican candidates, but actually fewer than 6. And we'll talk more about some of the notable gubernatorial races in just a minute here. Harris got more votes than 7 Democratic candidates, so actually outrunning some governors and fewer than 4. With attorney generals, Trump got more votes than 6 candidates, fewer than 4. Harris got more than the same thing, 6 candidates and fewer than 4. And in secretaries of state, Trump got more votes than 4 Republican candidates and fewer than 3. Harris got more votes than 5 Democratic candidates and fewer than 2. So down ballot, those numbers in terms of who's outrunning who are pretty close, except for, the states that had really interesting power changes and things like that.
Okay, so let's dig a little deeper into the governor's race. So there were 11 governorships up. Yeah. And as a reminder to listeners, none of those governorships actually changed party hands this year. It was kind of each party held serve in all the states. But when we crunch numbers a little more in detail, what do we find when you compare the presidential election results to those gubernatorial races?
Yeah, so there were 3 states this year that split their presidential and gubernatorial votes. These are actually the 3 states did the same exact thing in 2020 and 2016. And those are North Carolina, which backed a Republican presidential candidate and Democratic governor, and then Vermont and New Hampshire, both backed Harris, the Democratic presidential nominee, and Republican governors. Vermont, that gubernatorial race actually had the largest split as it relates to Republicans of any election in the country. Phil Scott, the Republican governor, got about 77% of the vote, Trump about 24%. Harris also outran Phil Scott's opponent by about 150,000 votes there. So that's Vermont. That was the biggest split. North Carolina is an interesting example. The Democratic gubernatorial candidate got about 55% of the vote, winning that election. Trump got 51% of the vote, narrowly winning. Trump outran the Republican nominee, Mark Robinson, there by about 600,000 votes. And interestingly, Harris received fewer votes by about 350,000 fewer than the Democratic nominee. So that's a really interesting case. And then the third, of course, was New Hampshire.
So real quick on North Carolina then, I lied, I am jumping in. what you're getting out of that race, and this is something we talked about earlier in the episode, you get a significant group of voters in North Carolina then who you would say they pulled the lever, they pushed the button for Trump and Stein.
Yeah.
That would be the combination you would see there of sorts, right?
Exactly. And then in Vermont, quite a few people voting for Harris, but also voting for the Republican candidate, Phil Scott, for governor. So in New Hampshire, which is the third state that split their gubernatorial and presidential vote, Republican gubernatorial nominee Kelly Ayotte got about 41,000 more votes than Donald Trump, winning the gubernatorial election, while Harris won the presidential election in the state.
All right, so tell us a little about North Carolina. We had some interesting sort of splits there as well. What else does North Carolina have in those other statewide races?
Yeah, New Hampshire is interesting in both Secretary of State and Attorney General races, splitting all three outcomes there. So New Hampshire, I'm sorry.
North Carolina.
Yes, the North Carolina.
Just keep talking.
I know. The North Carolina Secretary of State race. That was the widest case where Trump outran a Republican Secretary of State candidate, winning about 173,000 more votes than Chad Brown. Donald Trump won the state. Chad Brown lost the Secretary of State election. There was also a big split there among Democratic voters in the North Carolina Secretary of State race. Harris ran about 122,000 votes behind Elaine Marshall, the incumbent who defeated Chad Brown. So again, just like the gubernatorial race, a lot of voters splitting their ticket between Democratic Secretary of State candidate and a Republican presidential candidate. The Attorney General race was also, again, really interesting in North Carolina. Back Donald Trump, elected a Democratic Attorney General. Donald Trump got about 200,000 more votes than the losing Republican candidate for Attorney General there. So there's you could call it, I guess, a full triplex split in North Carolina.
Yeah. Yeah, and we saw some interesting results down in the state legislatures as well. Now, this is a little bit more difficult to nuance out in terms of ticket splitting, but there were some states where you would say Republicans won and Democrats made gains in the state, or the flip side situation where Democrats might have won a state presidentially, but Republicans essentially made gains down the ballot. So what are some of those interesting state legislative results where, again, to sort of use our ongoing visual, it's voter walks into the booth and more often than not, they're voting for one party for president and a different party is sort of winning the day down in the state legislative races. So what do we see in those chambers?
Yeah, I've got three examples. You can jump in with more, but Montana and Missouri, Democrats saw gains in the state legislatures there, while Donald Trump still won the state. Vermont, the Republican Party actually gained some state legislative seats. Donald Trump lost the state, but again, as we talked about before, Phil Scott won with about 77% of the vote. So a lot of those folks are increasingly backing Republican state legislative candidates, backing the Republican governor, but did not support Donald Trump in the presidential election.
Yeah, we also saw a state like Minnesota where they went from a Democratic trifecta to now a tied chamber, one of those rare occurrences. Very, very interesting results down the ballot as well. So what do we learn, Cory, comparing this to prior cycles then? What do we have a general sense of down ballot, more or less same kind of split ticketing situations going on from 2016?
I think it seems pretty roughly the same. There were marginally fewer splits in gubernatorial elections than some of the last presidential cycles. But I think what's really, really consistent is that New Hampshire, North Carolina, and Vermont keep splitting their vote between governors and their presidential election. All three states backed different candidates in their gubernatorial elections, presidential election in 2024, 2020, and 2016, which is, I don't know, pretty remarkably consistent. There were the number of gubernatorial and presidential splits was the same in 2023. If you go back to 2016, though, there were two more states, Montana and West Virginia, that backed Democratic governors and Donald Trump. So 5 states splitting between gubernatorial and presidential elections there. But it'll be fascinating, I guess, to see in 4 more years what happens with New Hampshire, North Carolina, and Vermont, and if they can keep that streak going.
Yeah, well, and before the election, quite a bit of ink was spilled about the presidential race. How there were these 7 battlegrounds, and essentially those are the battlegrounds that matter. And there are 43 states where it's pretty much known what the outcome would be. And we do see a lot of that at the statewide level as well, where the vast majority of state legislative races, the vast majority of statewide offices are pretty well known before the election. And over the last several cycles now, it's kind of drifted into, okay, these are the handful of states that are going to be considered toss-ups and battlegrounds for those statewide races. And they could go either way. And in many of the cases, like New Hampshire, like you're saying, they sort of do. They vacillate from cycle to cycle. So yeah, it does seem like that's certainly something we will see. I would expect to see more of that years ahead. Any other final little data points of interest or trends or notes, Cory, that we didn't get to that you've been particularly interested in as you've been working through our results articles the last few weeks?
Yeah, I'm interested in exploring. I haven't really looked at the numbers yet. I'm interested in exploring at some point what you might call splits, but they're not really splits between ballot measure results, ballot measures backed by Republican organizations or backed by Democratic affiliated organizations, and how those states performed relative to the president, or how those ballot measures performed relative to the presidential election. So I think that's a fascinating thing to look at that I'm looking forward to talking about more.
There's a lot of really interesting ballot results and that we've talked a lot about on the show, with things like obviously the big notable ones, the abortion measures, the ranked choice voting, the non-citizen voting ballot measures. Then there's also the interesting results that we saw with minimum wage in California.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of really fascinating that they're essentially all statewide ballot measures. And more than some prior cycles, we did have quite a few endorsements of those statewide ballot measures from presidential candidates. So yeah, there should be some pretty interesting data to dig into there as well. So that's going to be fun as we dig into that in the next few weeks ahead as we move to end this calendar year. So, Cory, great to have you on. Thanks for your time today. We'll have you certainly back on as we continue to publish more of these analysis articles. So, good to see you.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about our election coverage at the link in our show notes. We'll be back later this week with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Pallette, and thanks for listening.